My name is Shannon Morgan, and welcome to Bigfoot Encounters Narrated. Thank you for joining me again today as we dive into legends, reports, and encounter stories with Bigfoot. Before I get into today's video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you're looking for even more Bigfoot encounters, be sure to grab a copy of one of my books. Now it's time to sit back, relax, and enjoy the mystery. Thank you for being here with me, and I hope you enjoy today's video. My wife and I were traveling northeast on Highway 40, which also follows parts of the old Route 66, cutting through the mountainous region near Flagstaff, Arizona. This would have been sometime in the early 1990s, and we had our 3-month-old daughter in the back seat, bundled up in her car seat. It was snowing heavily. Visibility was poor, and we were taking it slow, climbing through the elevation where the pine trees grow thick on both sides of the highway. There were no other vehicles on the road at that time, and we had been driving for quite a while in complete isolation. No headlights ahead or behind us, and not a single sign of another car pulled over. The highway was flanked by dense forest, tower and ponderosa pines, and thick brush lining both sides. The road itself had a thin, fresh layer of snow on it, but not enough yet to force us to stop, although we were considering it if things got worse. At some point, probably 15 miles outside of Flagstaff, I pulled over to the shoulder to look at the map and double-check our route. GPS wasn't something that we had back then, and I wanted to make sure we hadn't missed a turnoff. The snow was starting to fall heavier, and I didn't want to make any mistakes driving unfamiliar mountain roads in those conditions. I turned on the dome light and I grabbed the paper map from the glove compartment. I was trying to orient it under the weak overhead light when something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. I didn't really register what I was seeing. There was a large, dark shape moving fast behind the car, larger than a man but on 2 legs. I instinctively turned my head to get a better look out the window, and my wife did the same. As soon as she laid eyes on it, she gasped and shouted, "Oh my God!" The urgency in her voice sent a chill through me. Through the swirling snow and low light, we could see it clearly enough. It was a massive, man-like figure, covered head to toe in thick, dark fur, that looked to have black and brown in the mix of fallen snow and the dim twilight. It was running upright directly towards our vehicle. Its arms were long and powerful, swinging in a very human way, but with an exaggerated reach. The head looked huge, almost blocky, and it sat low on wide, hunched shoulders. It was very large and bulky, and it was moving too powerfully to be a human being, especially in this kind of weather and elevation. We were parked idling on the shoulder, and this thing was maybe 40 feet behind the car and closing in fast. There was nothing else on the road, no headlights, tire tracks, or footprints. The snow was fresh and still lightly building up on the pavement. I remember this because I looked down in disbelief at the road before glancing back up. There was no other tracks, just our own. It hadn't come from any direction that we could trace. It was just suddenly there, and it was coming straight at us. I didn't wait around to see what it wanted. I flipped the map onto the floor, threw the car in drive, and I pulled back onto the highway, accelerating faster than I usually would in those conditions. My wife turned around in her seat, trying to keep an eye on it. But once we moved forward and the snowfall thickened, we lost sight of it within seconds. It didn't appear to chase after us, or at least, we couldn't see it continue down the highway. The baby was still asleep in the back, completely unaware. My wife and I kept looking at each other, not really knowing what to say. I asked her plainly, "You saw that too?" And she nodded, still wide-eyed. We didn't really talk about it again for the rest of the drive, and we didn't stop until we made it into town. Afterwards, I kept wondering how something that large could move so quickly and quietly, especially through freshly fallen snow. There was no tracks, no slipping or stumbling. It didn't look lost, and it didn't look like it was just out for a walk. It was coming at the vehicle like it had a reason to. If I hadn't turned on the dome light to check the map, I don't know if I ever would have noticed it in the mirror, and I don't want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't decided to drive off when I did. My wife still brings it up every now and then when we're talking about strange things that we've seen, and we're both very certain about what we saw. At this time, my whole family was really into camping. It was a regular thing for us. Every summer or long weekend, we would pack up and head somewhere remote. It was just how we spent our time together. Even now, as an adult, I still hunt and fish whenever I get the chance. I've always felt comfortable out in the woods. It's a familiar place to me, and I've never really been afraid of being alone in the wild, until one particular trip changed the way that I see the forest. This happened when I was 13 years old. We were camping somewhere in the Oak Creek Canyon area, near Slide Rock in Arizona. We had set up camp not far from the river, and I remember it being a beautiful stretch of land. Tall red cliffs in the distance, plenty of pine and oak trees, and the constant sound of running water. It was one of our better camping spots. As usual, I wandered off on my own to go fishing. I liked the quiet, and I liked doing things on my own. I followed the riverbank downstream a bit, and I found a good spot to cast. The water was clear and cold, and the area around me was quiet. Behind me, the forest got pretty thick. The trees were tall and close together, and the underbrush was dense, lots of scrub oak, manzanita, and low brush that made it hard to see very far in any direction once you stepped off the riverbank. I had my back to that, focused on the water, trying to spot trout. This is when I heard footsteps behind me, and they were very heavy. They were deep enough that I could almost feel them through the ground, like something or someone very large was walking just inside the tree line. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see one of my family members or maybe another camper, but there was nothing there. It was just dense green brush and tall tree trunks. The footsteps stopped as soon as I turned, and that silence felt loud all of a sudden. I stood there, trying to listen over the sound of the river, but there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it, or maybe an elk or a bear had moved off and then gotten quiet. I turned back around to the water and I got back to fishing, but 2 minutes later I heard it again, the same heavy thudding sound. These steps were close, maybe 40 feet behind me, and they had the same ground-shaking quality. I spun around again and I scanned the woods, but again I saw nothing. But this time, the sound didn't stop right away. The steps slowed and then came to a halt, and right after that, I heard something else. It was like deep breathing. It was the kind of breathing that someone makes when they're winded or trying to be quiet. It was definitely slow and loud, and whatever it was, you could tell it was big. It had this low, chesty sound to it, like the lungs on this thing were massive. I was scared, there's no other way to put it. I dropped down with my back to a tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. I didn't want to run and draw attention to myself, and I didn't want to call out either. I was 13 and on my own, and I knew something wasn't right. I pressed my back flat against a tree trunk, trying to look around without making too much movement. I stayed like that for what felt like forever. Realistically, it was probably around 20 minutes, but when you're that scared, time moves slowly. The breathing would stop and then start again, and then every now and then I would hear the steps shift position a little. It felt like it was circling, like whatever it wasn't sure what to do about me. I couldn't see it though. Every time I thought I had a bead on where it might be, it came up empty. Too many trees and too much cover. Eventually, it all stopped, the breathing and the walking, and everything went quiet again. After another long stretch of silence, I started to feel like maybe whatever it was had moved on. I got back up and I forced myself to shake it off. I picked up my fishing rod and I went back to what I was doing, but I couldn't shake that feeling that I wasn't alone. The hair on the back of my neck just wouldn't settle down. But then I heard it again, those same footsteps. This time they were off to my left and not directly behind me like before. I turned towards the sound, more cautious now, and I scanned the trees. At first I saw nothing, but then I caught a glimpse of movement between two tree trunks. It was a figure, not clearly visible, more of a shadow moving in the dark of the trees, but it was unmistakable in its shape and size. It was well over 6 feet tall and covered in shaggy dark fur, dark brown, maybe black, but it looked thick, maybe 3 inches long or so. I only saw it for a couple of seconds before it then moved off, angling away from me and deeper into the forest. I never saw the face, the eyes, or the hands, or anything like that, but I could tell from the shape of it and the way that it moved that it was not a bear and it definitely was not a human. Eventually, I made my way back to camp and I didn't say anything to anyone. I was embarrassed, honestly. I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but I know that I hadn't. It wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't just the imagination of a kid spooking himself in the woods. This experience has stayed with me for my entire life. I still hunt and fish and go out into the woods, but after that day, I always keep an extra level of awareness, especially when I'm alone. There's something out there, something big, quiet, and smart. 15 years ago, my girlfriend at the time and I took a trip from our home in Albuquerque, New Mexico to Los Angeles to visit my mother. It was a long drive, and we had decided to make the most of it by turning the return leg into a bit of a road trip. On our way back to New Mexico, we decided to stop at the Grand Canyon since she had never seen it before. I had been once as a kid, but even then I knew it was the kind of place that deserved more than one visit in a lifetime. She was really excited about it, and I thought that it would be a nice detour. We reached the South Rim late in the afternoon, just in time to catch the sunset. We parked, walked around for a bit, took a few photos, and then found a spot to sit quietly while the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time we got back to the car, it was fully dark. We weren't planning to camp there. We still had plans to make it to Flagstaff that night. Instead of taking the more traveled way back towards the interstate, I decided to take a less used highway as a shortcut. I'll admit, I can't remember the exact highway number now, but I believe it cut through some fairly remote stretches of forest before connecting back towards Flagstaff. I've always had a bit of a preference for back roads. They're quieter, more peaceful, less traffic. In hindsight, I should have stuck with the main route, but at the time, it seemed like a fine idea. There was hardly any other traffic. The occasional pair of headlights would appear in the distance and then disappear again. Mostly, it was just us on the road. The forest closed in on both sides in long black walls, and our headlights were the only light cutting through the darkness. That stretch of highway has a lot of turns and curves, and I remember we had just come out of one of the sharper bends and onto a straightaway that ran for maybe half a mile. This is when we saw something walking along the shoulder of the road ahead, off to the right-hand side. At first, it just looked like a figure. It was upright and walking like a person would, but then I noticed that it was noticeably taller and broader than a human. We weren't close enough yet to see any details, but the silhouette stood out in the beams of the headlights. My girlfriend leaned forward in her seat and asked, "Is that a bear?" She wasn't being sarcastic. She was genuinely unsure of what she was seeing, and to her credit, that wasn't a bad guess. We don't get many upright walking bears in this part of the country, but if you didn't know what else it could be, it might have looked like something like that from a distance. But even as she said it, I was already realizing that it wasn't a bear. It was walking in very long fluid strides, like a man, but heavier. I slowed the car down, and as we got closer, the headlights shone more of the figure. It was covered from head to toe in brown to light brown hair, more like hair than fur, if that makes sense. It wasn't patchy or mangy like you might see on a bear. It was dense and fairly even in length. I stopped the car entirely, and for a moment we just sat there looking at it. It was maybe 50 yards away, probably a little less, enough that I could now make out some detail in the lights. When the car came to a stop, the figure stopped too, and then it turned to face us. Not just the head, but the whole upper body moved. This is when I saw something weird about its movement. It didn't just turn its head like a person would. It had to shift its entire torso, like its neck wasn't flexible, or like its head was set onto its shoulders. The movement was smooth, but also unnatural in a human sense. Now that it was facing us, I could see the shape of its face. It was mostly hairless, with skin that looked dark or grayish in the headlights. The features were heavy, with a flat nose, a wide mouth, and deep-set eyes that reflected green in the lights, similar to like a dog's or a cat's eyes will shine at night. There was no visible expression on its face, it just stared at us. I didn't notice any obvious signs of gender, and the body didn't have much visible definition. There was no bulging muscles or distinct curves. It was just thick and solid under all of that hair. The creature stood still for what felt like a full minute. It then tilted its head slightly, looking at us with an expression I can only describe as curious. Then, I saw it run its tongue slowly across the upper front teeth, almost like it was thinking. It was such a human-like thing to do, but at the same time, it felt completely alien in context. It then took a small step towards us, just one, and that was all it took for my girlfriend to absolutely lose it. She screamed, loud, high-pitched, and full of pure terror, and I can't blame her. This thing had been strange enough just standing there, but the idea that it might come closer was more than she could handle. As soon as she screamed, the creature froze, and then, in one motion, it turned back towards the woods and walked off the road. It took just a couple of strides, and then it was out of the headlights and gone into the trees, and we never saw it again. She was panicked and wanted to leave right then and there, and I agreed. I eased the car forward and gave a wide berth to the spot where it had stood. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't afraid in the way that she was. Shocked, yes. Overwhelmed, definitely. But I never got the impression that it did mean us harm. It felt more like we had stumbled into its world, and it had taken a moment to observe us, just like we were observing it. But still, I knew we needed to go. There was nothing more to see, and the last thing I wanted was to provoke something unpredictable. The rest of the drive into Flagstaff was very quiet. My girlfriend didn't say much, and after a few attempts to talk about it, I stopped trying. She was visibly shaken, pale, and trembling, and by the time we checked into a cheap motel for the night, she had shut down completely. She refused to talk about what we saw, and to this day, I'm convinced she's blocked it out entirely. She never spoke of it again, and if I ever brought it up months later, years later, she would just wave it off like it never even happened. For me, it was the opposite. I never forgotten a single detail. I know what I saw, and I know that it was real. It was not a man in a suit or a bear. On the night of December 24th, 2000, Christmas Eve, my cousin and I were on the road, heading east towards Winslow, Arizona. We had left a family gathering earlier that evening, and we were driving along Highway 87. The road was quiet and mostly deserted, as you might expect for a holiday night. We were about 30 miles outside of Winslow in the general area of Jack's Canyon, when we saw something that neither of us had an explanation for. We were just talking casually, listening to the radio, when the headlights of the car shone on something walking across the right shoulder of the highway, moving in the same direction that we were headed. It was tall, well over 6 feet, and it was covered in hair from head to toe. It had a thick, solid build and a long stride. My cousin and I both went quiet as we passed it. We got a clear look at it in the beams of the lights for about 3 or 4 seconds. Right as we got closer and past it, it did something strange. It lifted one of its arms and brought its hand or forearm up to cover its face, as if it didn't want to be seen. It just turned its head slightly away and covered up, almost like it was reacting to the lights. The moment that we passed it, we both turned towards each other in the car at the same time and said something like, "What was that?" It wasn't a person, that much we agreed on immediately. It was too big, and the way that it moved didn't seem like a person. We decided to turn around and go back to see if we could see it again. It had only been about 15 seconds since we passed it, so it couldn't have gone far. I turned the car around at the next safe spot and we drove back slowly to the location that we had seen it. When we got back to that stretch of road near Jack's Canyon, there was nothing there. We pulled over and used flashlights to scan the area near the shoulder. I even got out of the car and I looked around a bit. There wasn't much traffic and we didn't feel scared, but the creature, or whatever it was gone. The thing that we both remember most vividly was the way that it moved and the gesture it made when we passed it. The way that it shielded its face was bizarre. It wasn't like it was startled, but it was like it was trying to avoid being seen clearly. It wasn't until a few days later, after the holidays, that we brought it up with a few people that we trusted. One of them mentioned Bigfoot, and at the time, I hadn't really given much thought to that possibility. I always thought that kind of thing was up in the Pacific Northwest, if it even existed at all. But after seeing whatever it was near Jack's Canyon, I started to reconsider. My boyfriend and I have always made it a point to get as far off the beaten path as possible when we go camping. We like to push just a little deeper each time, and this past trip was no exception. On October 8th, we headed out again, this time a little further in than our last trip. We didn't really have a destination in mind, just somewhere remote enough where we wouldn't be bothered, and hopefully wouldn't see another soul all weekend. We found a spot tucked back beyond a rough dirt road, surrounded by deep canyons and thick tree cover. It took us less than an hour to get everything set up. We had our tent pitched and our gear sorted pretty quickly. Once everything was in place, we just relaxed and soaked in the scenery, glad to be away from everything. Around 7 p.m. we started a fire. It was getting cold pretty fast. One of those nights where the temperature drops hard the moment that the sun goes down. We bundled up, got some food going, and we sat there talking. It was about an hour later, maybe a little after 8 p.m. when things changed. We were mid-conversation when I heard something. I stopped talking and I turned to my boyfriend. I told him, "Shh, listen." He quieted down, and within seconds it happened again. What we heard came from a distance, but it was crystal clear. A scream, long, sharp, and powerful, cut across the wilderness like it was right out of a movie. Then came another one and another. We started counting. By the time it stopped, we had counted 12 full screams. The last two were noticeably different than the first 10. They weren't just loud, they sounded tortured. There was something in them that was almost hard to describe. It wasn't just the volume or the pitch, it was the emotion. The final 2 screams sounded like something in pain, not injured in a typical way, but like something was suffering on a deeper level. I was half scared out of my wits. I turned to my boyfriend, asking him to tell me what we had just heard, as if he could. But all he could do was stare off in the direction of the sound and say, "I don't know." He wasn't any less shaken than I was. Based on what we could tell, the sound had come from the east, out past the canyon. It was hard to judge the distance, especially with the steep ridges and valleys. Sound travels differently out there, but still, we both agreed it had to have been at least 2 miles away, maybe even more. But even at that distance, it came through loud and clear. I tried to reason through it. I know there are plenty of animals in the Arizona wilderness, and I've heard my fair share of strange sounds at night. But we started going down the list. Mountain lion, bobcat, elk, bear, even javelina, though they're not usually found in higher elevations like where we were. One by one, we ruled all of them out. None of these animals could make a sound like this, and if it had been a person, that would have raised even more questions. There's no way a human can produce that kind of volume and range. I didn't really sleep very well that night. I laid there in the tent, listening and waiting for anything else unusual. Every little crack of a branch or rustle in the brush put me totally on edge. We didn't hear any more screams, but the silence wasn't exactly comforting either. When we packed up and left, it was all we talked about. The drive home, the entire day afterward, we just kept going over it. What could have made that sound? What could scream like that in that way with that level of intensity? When we got home, I decided to play one of my old Bigfoot DVDs. I skipped straight to the part with the audio clips, and as soon as one of them played, we just looked at each other. It was so similar. It was almost identical in tone and projection, and that's when the real questions started coming in. If that scream we heard was anything like those recordings, then what does that mean? Since then, I've gone looking for every audio clip I can find. Online, podcasts, documentaries. I wanted to hear them all. And the more I listened, the more I'm convinced that we might have been closer to something than we realized. I even started marking down areas on a map, comparing reports and sighting. Looking at the bigger picture, it doesn't seem so far-fetched. New Mexico isn't far, and neither is Texas. There have been plenty of encounters reported in both states, so why not Arizona? Next time, I'm not going in unprepared. I've already picked out a compact audio recorder. It's going in my gear bag. I don't care how remote we are, I want to be ready. If something like this happens again, I want proof. I've made it a personal mission now. Wherever the sightings are reported, I'll follow up on them. Dense wilderness, any state, it doesn't matter. I want answers, and I won't be caught off guard again. It was around 6 p.m., and my plan had been to meet up with my wife later that evening at Forest Road 115. We were several miles deep into the backcountry, in a fairly remote section of the woods. My son and I had been camping out there for a couple of days, and we were just starting to break things down and getting ready to leave the site. I had just stood up from my camp chair to start packing when I saw movement in my vision to the left, just beyond the edge of the clearing. What I saw immediately struck me as unusual. It looked like an extremely large man, exceptionally tall and wide, wearing a ghillie suit. It was moving from right to left across a natural opening between the trees about 30 yards away. The brush was sparse enough in that area that I had a clear, unobstructed view of its upper body and a fairly good view of the lower half as well. The figure was covered in head to toe in what appeared to be dark, tangled hair or material. The arms were swinging in a natural gait, long and pendulous. My son, who had also seen it, noted the separation in the legs as it walked. Each step was very smooth, but the stride was unnaturally long. We both stood there watching, completely silent. If it was a person, they were huge. I didn't see any kind of backpack or gear, no weapon, or indication that it was a hunter, and that raised a red flag for me. At that time of year, hunting season had been closed for at least a week, and the next one wouldn't be opening for quite a while. There was no reason anyone should have been out there dressed like this, or even out there at all, really. This part of the forest was very isolated. We hadn't seen anyone in days, and no one knew our exact location. I decided to try to get a better sense of the scale. I had my son, who stands exactly 6 feet tall, go stand in the spot where the figure had walked through. From my vantage point at the campsite, I compared the two. Where the top of his head reached, based on where that thing's shoulders had been, the figure had to have been at least 1.5 feet taller than him. This would put it in the ballpark of 7.5 feet tall. And it wasn't just the height. This thing was thick across the chest and shoulders, much wider than any human frame. If it was a person, then they were built like a linebacker and on stilts, and they were somehow walking around in a full ghillie suit in the middle of nowhere for no good reason. For something of that size, I also would have expected more noise, like branches breaking, but it had moved almost silently. That's something I wouldn't have thought much about until much later, but it did add another layer to how strange the whole thing was. We were there for several minutes after, watching the tree line where it had disappeared. There was nothing else, no follow-up sounds or movement. Eventually, we packed up and we headed out to meet my wife like we had planned. But the image of that thing walking casually through the woods has stayed in my brain ever since. In September of 2008, during archery season, my brother, sister, nephew, daughter, and I were camping in the Kaibab National Forest, on the north side of the Grand Canyon. We were hunting as we did every year, and we had set up our camp not far from where members of our family had previously had a strange encounter. Because of that, we were already on alert and curious about the area. That Friday night, around 9 p.m., my sister and I decided to walk a short distance down the road from our campsite to try some vocalizations. We tried a few long howls and a series of whoops spaced out over about half an hour. We weren't trying to provoke anything aggressive, just trying to see if we could get a response or a reaction of any kind. Nothing responded, and after standing quietly for a bit, we decided to head back to camp. Once we returned, my sister took my daughter and nephew into the camp trailer to settle them down for the night. The trailer was parked slightly offset from where a fire pit was, and from where my brother and I had set up our camp chairs. Shortly after they went inside, the situation changed abruptly. My brother and I were still seated by the fire when we both heard a sudden, very loud snapping sound, something like a large branch either being snapped off or stepped on, and it wasn't subtle. It echoed enough that we both stopped talking and looked in the same direction. We didn't move, though. We stayed in our chairs and we tried to act like we weren't alarmed, hoping that by staying quiet, we might hear something else, and we did. Over the next 30 minutes, it became clear that something, actually more than one thing, was circling the camp, and it wasn't stealthy. It made plenty of noise as it moved through the trees and brush. There was snapping, thudding, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the growth. One of them was on the northwest side of our camp and moved in an arc that went past our northern flank towards the eastern side. The second circled the backside of the trailer, behind where my brother and I were sitting. We could tell there was two, because sometimes they were both making noise at once, doing different things in different locations. Occasionally, we would hear the sound of branches being shaken, and this wasn't a breeze or a single rustle, but an aggressive movement like someone rattling a small tree. The grass in that area was tall, and we also heard heavy footsteps moving through it, making a kind of crunching, swishing sound as something big made its way through. Then came the rocks and the sticks. The first thing we noticed was the sound of a stick landing on top of the tarp that we had strung up next to the trailer for shade. The thump that it made wasn't enormous, but it was obvious. Then, more started landing around the camp. Small rocks and twigs were tossed from all different directions. They were sporadic, but also consistent over time. At one point, a rock, roughly the size of a softball, landed with a solid thud between our chairs and the trailer, and this one really spooked us. It was close enough to start making us nervous. After this, we lost our nerve. We got up, went into the trailer, and closed the door behind us. Once inside, we found that my sister and nephew were still awake and had heard most of what we had. My sister said she had been listening to something moving back and forth behind the trailer for some time. She described a loud, heavy exhale, what she called a sigh, that she had heard near the back window. She also said she heard branches breaking and what sounded like small objects hitting the sides of the trailer. My nephew backed her up and said that he had heard it too. We tried to go to sleep after this, but not long after we turned off all the lights, another noise jolted us. Just outside the trailer, maybe 3 feet away, we had a metal storage box where we kept food, sitting on a small folding table. The sound that we heard was metallic, like something had knocked hard on the box or thrown something solid at it. The impact was loud and sudden, and we froze but didn't go outside. Eventually, everyone but my brother managed to fall asleep. He told us the next morning that he continued to hear sticks and rocks hitting the sides of the trailer for quite a while, after the rest of us had dozed off. He finally drifted off sometime after midnight, but said he was woken up again during the early hours by a strange dragging sound. According to him, it felt and sounded like a long stick or branch was being dragged slowly across the canvas roof of the trailer, directly over his head. It started on one side and continued to the other and then stopped. The next day, we didn't try any more vocalizations. My nephew was so rattled from the night before that he made himself sick with worry. We spent the day checking around the campsite for any signs, but the ground was covered in a dense layer of leaves and pine needles, so there wasn't any tracks. What we did find were some of the small sticks and pebbles that had been tossed into the camp the night before, scattered around the trailer and the tarp. That evening, the weather changed. A light rain started to fall, and another hunting group moved into the area about a mile or so down the road. We kept mostly to ourselves that night. Then, on Sunday night, my sister and I decided to try one more set of vocalizations. This time, we went down to the opposite direction on the road, hoping maybe a different position would get a response. We repeated the same howls and whoops as before and waited, but again there was no reply. We walked to camp and we sat around the fire for a while, maybe half an hour, but there was no activity. Eventually, we decided to call it a night and we went to bed. Sometime during the night, something returned. All 3 of us adults inside the trailer were woken repeatedly by the entire trailer being shaken. Not once or twice, but at least 6 different times over the course of the night, and it wasn't the wind. The motion wasn't a sway from one side. It was more like something grabbing one side of the trailer and then wrenching it hard, twisting it side to side with force. It felt physical and aggressive. Every time it happened, it was the same kind of motion, short, intense bursts of violent shaking. Around midnight, my brother said he heard a growl. He described it as low, deep, and sustained, and lasted close to 10 seconds. He said it was subtle in tone, but powerful enough that he could feel the vibration of the sound in his body, as though it was resonating through the trailer itself. It disturbed him enough that he didn't fall back asleep for a long time afterwards. By morning, we were ready to leave. No one felt comfortable staying any longer. We packed up and headed home. Aside from the sticks and rocks, we never found any other physical evidence. But we didn't need physical proof to know that something weird had happened. This wasn't an animal acting out of curiosity. The behavior was far outside the realm of normal wildlife activity, and we haven't returned to that particular site since. Something happened to my husband Chris and his brother while they were out grouse hunting in the Kaibab National Forest in Arizona. This took place early Saturday morning around 2 o'clock in the morning on September 13, 2008. They had gone up into the Kaibab the day before and were camping in a pop-up camper not far off one of the forest roads. They were both experienced outdoorsmen and spent a fair amount of time in the woods, particularly during hunting season. Chris told me he was sound asleep when he was jolted awake by a strange movement. It felt like something was pushing the camper from the outside, not just once but repeatedly, every few moments, like a shove or a nudge. He thought it might have been his brother moving around in his sleep and causing the camper to shift, so he got up, walked over to the other bed, and woke his brother to ask if he was tossing and turning. His brother told him no, he had been asleep the whole time and he hadn't moved at all. This is when Chris decided to step outside and take a look around. He brought his flashlight and circled the camper slowly, expecting to see maybe a deer or an elk that had wandered close to camp. But there was nothing, no eyeshine or animals in sight. He stood quietly for a few moments, scanning the surrounding tree line and listening. This is when he heard footsteps in the woods behind the camper. He described them as steady walking, not the quick, erratic movements that you would expect from a deer. It sounded like something big was walking just beyond where the beam of the flashlight could reach. He tried to shine his light in that direction, but the forest was thick, and the light didn't penetrate very far. He couldn't see anything, but the sound was definitely there. Something was walking, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. After 2 minutes, the footsteps stopped and everything went silent. Chris went back inside the camper unsettled, but also not alarmed. As soon as he got back in and closed the door, that's when the whooping started. He said it was loud, powerful, and nothing like he had heard before. It came from the same general direction where he had heard the footsteps, out in the trees behind the camper. And the sound wasn't just a one-off. It continued for a while, almost like a call and repeat type of vocalization. Chris has hunted for years and spent countless nights in remote places, and he told me flat out that he had never heard anything like it before. The sound was unnerving enough that they both stayed awake for quite some time afterwards. Nothing else happened that night, the whooping eventually stopped, and there was no more disturbances. The next morning, Chris couldn't find any tracks or physical evidence around the camper, but he was still nervous by what he had heard. A few days later, I started doing some research online to see if anyone else had reported similar experiences in the area, or if anyone could explain the sound. This is when I came across a website, and to my surprise, I found an audio clip that matched what Chris described. He listened to the clip with me, and he almost immediately recognized it. He said, "That's it. That's exactly what I heard out there." That's it for today's encounters. I hope you enjoyed them, and thank you so much for listening. It would mean a lot to me if you could like, comment, and share this video. It really does help my channel grow. Also, please take a minute to grab a copy of one of my books, The Sinister Truth and The Sinister Truth 2, which are now available on Amazon in paperback and hardcover copies. Lynn also has a few books to check out too if you haven't already. Your support on these projects mean a lot to us, and we can never thank you enough. We've also got some awesome merchandise available on our Fourth Wall site. If you love what we do and are looking for more ways to show your support, we have t-shirts, mugs, hoodies, and more. Thank you again for always being here and taking the time to listen. You are so appreciated, and I hope to see you in the next video.